Hi, this is Peter Teuscher. I'm here with Toby Dempker. Thanks for joining us for another podcast where we pick a topic and see where the conversation takes us. We talk about personal development, professional development, and a little bit of philosophy. So eager to chat again, Toby. It feels like it's been a while, actually, since
Yeah, I
we
know.
chatted a lot. I guess a lot has happened in 2 weeks. But
Yeah, it's been Easter and been having some downtime, so that's it's
exactly, yeah.
yeah.
I was away. I had a nice little trip to Greece. So yeah, good. But I'm looking forward to jumping right into it. So I don't know if you had any afterthoughts to our. We did our last session was on managing meetings. I don't
Hmm.
know if you had any afterthoughts on what we discussed there.
And actually, no, I mean it's been Easter holiday, so I haven't had that many meetings either.
Yeah, exactly.
But well, okay, well, I just it's all there in the conscious. I mean, I had a meeting last night with another organization, and just going back to basic principles, so what's the agenda? And we hadn't talked about it, so just setting those foundations. It's so important to be a little bit effective. Otherwise, it's really nice. You sit and chit chat, but if you really want to have some outcomes, you really need to have those basic principles in place to make it happen.
Absolutely. I think the main thing I was thinking of is I'm really looking forward to actually having in-person meetings with people, like live, doing workshops again. There's lots coming up, and live coaching with people, not just virtually. I mean, there's lots of great things you can do virtually, but it's just nice to have human contact again, and
Mm.
it's a different energy and so on. Yeah, so that's great. And before we jump in the topic, I want to do a bit of a shout out to some listeners where it seems we're trending in Ghana. So our friends in Africa, thanks for listening. It's great to know that you can have these, we have these very kind of intimate discussions, and it's great to see that people around the world are actually listening. So
Yeah.
on the podcasting side of it. So great. So I have picked a topic today that I think is very relevant with a lot of things going on right now, and it can be very philosophical, but also very practical. So today I
Mm.
want to talk about defining truth, and this has many applications and implications, and so I think we're living in a time with tons of information and tons of people vying for our attention, and also trying to define what truth is. So I think this is really important for on an individual level for people to recognize what their truth is, and understanding that they've probably only got a slice of the truth, not the whole truth.
Mm.
I find that a lot of people aren't actually looking for the truth; they're just looking for evidence of their own beliefs are true. And then with world events going on, I know there was can't remember the name of the gentleman, but he was a U.S. senator who said, the first casualty of war is truth. Um,
Hmm.
and also, there are a lot of people, with causes and things they want to support, and so they have their own view of things, and they want to promote that as the truth. And you see that within organizations. You see that in relationships, people fighting about what's true about what
Mm.
someone said or didn't say, and so I think the thing that I'd like to get out of today is really to look at how do we go about defining truth, and how much can we actually know. I think when
Mm.
someone as wise as Socrates, admitted that he knew nothing, or
Mm.
he claimed to know nothing. Obviously, he knew a lot, but in terms of the greater scope of things, how much
Mm.
do we actually know? We
Mm.
did a podcast on beliefs before, and I talked about how much of our daily lives, how much of our world is built on beliefs rather than particular facts or truths.
Mm.
And so we all see the world from our own vantage point and our own perspective, and so I think that there's a lot to be said for recognizing that two opposing things can be true, and it seems true from your perspective, but from another person's perspective, they have a different lived experience. So those are all the things I want to bring to the conversation today. And then hopefully when we go out in the world, or when we interact with other people, or when we interpret what we're seeing, we are a little bit more careful or a little bit more thoughtful about what we consider to be true, and then what we want to defend and fight for. So that's where I'd like to start the conversation today.
Yeah, great. I mean, yeah, first of all, to me, this is a really philosophical
Sure.
topic. And immediately what I start thinking about is, how do we, okay, so if the topic is defining truth, how do we discuss it in a forum that we can actually manage the conversation, or at least understand what we're talking about? Because the first thing I'm thinking about, well, we don't know what we don't know, right? So how we can never know the truth in that sense, right? We can never
Exactly.
know. I mean, in 400 years ago or 500 years ago, that it was the common belief that the Earth was flat, but nobody really believes that nowadays. And we might see that as a truth, but do we understand all the shapes and spheres of the great cosmos? No, we don't, right? We don't know how time aligns, etc., etc. So there's a lot of things that we can never really comprehend. So how do we manage the topic? I mean, where do we draw the boundaries? Because we can't really talk about what we don't know anyway. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. And this is where I say it has very deep philosophical implications, but certainly also very practical ones. Because if we want to talk about the workplace, and or in personal relationships, or when I talk a lot about developing a philosophy. So it's very important to recognize what's true for you, because we all have different lived experiences. I think a big one that really affects the workplace, affects individual relationships, is that a lot of people have this, and it's a very ego-driven need, is this need to be right. Right. So we, and again, going back to, a lot of people aren't looking for the truth. They're looking for evidence that their beliefs are true. And so you have these assumptions that I know what's true, and I'm going to convince everybody else.
Yeah.
Right. And this has implications for the way we communicate with each other. Instead of listening, we're trying to think of the thing that's going to prove our point. And so when we're looking to define truth, there are a lot of things to consider. What are my personal biases, and even things like empathy, and trying to put yourself in someone else's shoes to get a bigger slice of the truth. Because, as I said before, no one can really have the whole truth, because we can't see things from everyone's perspectives, right? And so, people will disagree with me that there are some definite truths that are indisputable.
True, what do I call it? True facts.
Yeah.
This is a true fact.
Yeah. And that's funny, because now you've even got people that are with this new speak in media and so on, where they talk about, well, there are alternative facts. Well, are they facts, or are they not? Alternative facts.
Yeah.
So anyway, it's becoming more and more difficult to decipher and to sort through all of the information that we have available to us.
Yeah, for sure.
And so I think the first thing to admit is, we can't know the full truth. It's very difficult. I think you need to find what's true for you, and then hopefully that doesn't lead to conflicts or things that are they're going to make life challenging, whether it's your workplace or whether it's your relationships and so on. So I think it's taking care to, when you're defining what truth is for you, making sure that you are aware of the things that are influencing and biasing your opinion.
Yeah, and I find a lot of well, when I get concerned about these things, I always put my trust in sort of science and academia, and how far, that there is a true search for truth there. But I mean, the fact is that there are a lot of different narratives and a lot of different schools of thoughts and a lot of different ideas. And whatever we can perhaps clinically or scientifically prove today, that definitely might not be true in 100 years when we have a lot more information, a lot more other facts to consider. So even if something can be defined in a scientific kind of way as truth today, that might not be true in 50 years or 10 or whatever it is, right? So things can also change. New discoveries are giving us new lights and stuff and new things. And even in the world of academia, we also know about, well, face and personal status and personal bias, and these do come into play, right? There's the world of academia and science isn't isolated and protected from these personal or mental biases that we all are exposed to, right?
No, so, and there are all kinds of pressures and incentives, whether it's within academia or within science, that will then it will then encourage bias, or whether it's conscious or unconsciously, people will have things that motivate them to see the world in a certain way. And I think that's just an important thing for us to recognize. And so I was listening to an interview with Elon Musk recently. It was part of a TED Talk in Vancouver, where I'm, originally from, and it was interesting to hear him say that one of the things that he's been very passionate about from an early age is discovering truth. This is why he sort of had this interest in physics and in the sciences and so he's very passionate about this. And so now he's making this bid to try to buy Twitter because he believes in free speech and an open discourse in order to find, where is the truth. And that's why he believes in science. And so I agree with you that, academia and science are important. And your point before was really important as well, that the example of there was a time when everybody believed that the world was flat. And so what the majority believes is not always the truth. It's not always,
Sure.
and so these are all factors that I think are important to reflect on when we're trying to figure out what's true. And I don't think there's any way I think the first thing to do is to recognize that you'll probably never definitively know the truth about a lot of things. I think you can follow the evidence. But what happens in science and academia is there's a particular lens that, look at things through. So there's a couple there, they're evolutionary biologists, Brett Weinstein and Heather Heying. They have a podcast as well. And I really like their insightful consideration of a lot of things. And they will say that they look through things through an evolutionary lens, right? So right there, they have a vantage point from which they look to see the truth and search for evidence. And then, and that can be very relevant, but it's looking at things from a certain angle, right? And so what happens if you look at something from another angle, right? So from a different philosophical angle and so on. So will you see a different truth? And I think that's an important thing to note, that people who, whether it's look at politics, people will have a certain orientation politically or spiritually with a certain faith that they believe in, and that will affect what they see and what they believe. And that's why it's so important not to make people wrong. Like, I'm right and you're wrong, but there's a truth out there, and we're all trying to get a piece of it, right? And I think that's just that's what I continue to want to hit home with people is, it's let go of the need to be right, and recognizing that as you're trying to define what truth is, that there are just so many different perspectives to look at it through, right?
Yeah, and that's and that's the great quality of argumentation and discussion in science and academia, I think, because you're always encouraged to look at things from these different perspectives and take different narratives into play. and try to discuss one topic from a lot of because you have to prepare for that critique. If I'm looking at this from a I don't know, from a leftist point of view or a socialistic point of view, what are the conservatives going to say, and how do you sort of respond to that critique, etc. So you have to take these different perspectives and narratives to account when you're discussing an argument, arguing for your case. So that's something that I really appreciate about this. But of course, I mean, the defined truth. It's that's another issue.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why, it's a bit of a, is it even, that's a very philosophical question, is it even possible to define sort of a universal truth, right? So, and in science, where there's an empirical method where it's, you only trust the things that are observable, but as you said, if you go into the deep rabbit hole of philosophy and quantum physics, what can you know? So let's say theoretically we're living in a matrix type universe, right? Where it's almost like a simulation. Then the empirical method would only serve to confirm the matrix. It would only reconfirm the illusion that you're already living in. So. And so if you look at some of the sort of Eastern spiritual philosophies, they see life as, there's this veil between us and the truth, and we live in this illusion. So, and if that's the truth you want to live by, this is the thing: defining your truth will impact how you live your life in the same way that, as this is the whole thing about developing a philosophy and set of beliefs, because they will influence your behavior and the way you see the world and the way you think. And so as you define things as true, just by definition, by labeling something what it is, you are then also defining what it's not, right? So you're placing limits, you're creating limits. So this, and then again, this has very practical implications, because what is true for you as an individual, what is true for you within a relationship, what is true for you in a workplace, or about the way you are defining yourself, what's true, in that perspective, and that has very real world implications, and I think that's why it's so important to talk about.
Yeah. So, to be a bit challenging here, then, are we setting up an impossible dichotomy here, where we're saying, at the one hand side, we should make our choices and find our values to put up our own leadership philosophy, or a life philosophy, or whatever we want to call it, to define how we see the truth. So that's one part of the dichotomy. The other one is that there is no truth, or that it's impossible for us to define what's right or wrong. So that's, this is a thing that can't be done. Do you know what I'm saying? So so how can this? I guess the question, if I would say the question for you then, is how do we balance that? And how do we balance that dichotomy of setting up our own boundaries, or our own our own platform in sense of a philosophy, while understanding that we're living in a universe where we can't define things, or we can't see the truth.
Yeah, I think that's one of the first admissions to make, is to recognize that you can never be absolutely sure of. There are things where you can be reasonably sure of. There's no guarantee in life, and the things that we think or hold as true for a long period of time can be revealed to be false. In which case they were never true. We just believed they were. And so this is why this. Whether it's because there's so much information out there, you see media outlets, you see people who are trying to gain your attention, you see people trying to market things, and they're all trying to tell you what is true. And this is the important point when we're trying to define what's true, recognizing or keeping in the back of our heads that that's somewhat of an impossible task. There's relative truth. I mean, look, a very basic scientific fact: light can be a particle and a wave. And that was something that that would have been deemed to be heresy in science. But so those would seem to be two things that couldn't be true at the same time. And there are a lot of examples in life. And then so look at with your kids more. That they'll come to you and they'll blame each other for something, or they'll have a fight. And they'll each tell their side of the story, and they believe that that they're telling the truth, or maybe they're being dishonest. But it can happen that two people are genuinely arguing for something and saying this is the truth, and they'll never meet eye to eye, and they'll agree to disagree. But for each of them, there's that truth, and I think that's the recognition that needs to be made. Is as we're trying to find truth in the world, or as we're trusting a certain source of information to be the truth, recognize that it may there will be bias there. That may not be 100% of the truth. That there are some facts there, but there are some facts that are missing, that take away that are needed for context, and therefore how close can you get to the truth, right?
Yeah, and that's I mean, in my situation, when I'm dealing so much with China and with the relationship between China and basically the rest of the world today, there's such a strong diversification in the way we view the world, and the one part cannot or do not want to understand the other, and it's becoming so much more obvious, right? So I get all kinds of questions about that. How can they think like that? How can they live like that? How can they have the system? How, like somebody asked me the other day, like, what is it like to live in a dictatorship? And if you ask a Chinese person, well, I mean, most of the Chinese person, they will say, well, we don't see it that way. We don't feel like that. But how is it to live in chaos? They are viewing us from a completely different perspective. So and that's pulling part of things apart, and that's what's so frustrating. Instead of getting closer to each other and understanding each other better, we're going the opposite way. For me, that's a really frustrating situation. But I mean, that's why I like this discussion that we're having, because to emphasize the need to look for empathy and understanding, and not point out what the other person is doing wrong, trying to understand, how do you view the world? How do you view things? What do we have in common? What can we start building on? Instead of pointing fingers, saying that you are wrong and you are also wrong. It's not leading anywhere.
Yeah, and this is the reason for open debate, because now we have, we talked about science, and you'll have experts that are, that disagree with each other. And then depending who has the power of influence, or the channel of, the access to people, they can try and control the narrative by saying, no, that person's kind of, that's a fringe opinion. This is the truth. And I think when people try to shut down debate, that's where that raises red flags for me when I'm trying to figure out what the truth is. I remember having a conversation with some friends from my English writers group here, and we were talking about the news, and I said, well, sometimes I'll watch clips from Fox News, and because I want to know what a different perspective sounds like, what other people are thinking. And right away, you shouldn't watch that. That's all misinformation and so on. And I'm like, well, what are you afraid of? You're afraid of me looking at it, not being able to discern, or not being able to have a critical view. I think if all you do is get all your information from one source, then I have a friend, and she believes in the New York Times because it's the paper of record, and and fair enough. They probably have a long track record and so on.
Mm.
But they also have a certain perspective that, is
Mm.
not without its bias. So I think
Mm.
that's why it's so important to have discussion, to try and look at things from different angles and different perspectives, and to not make other people wrong right away, and to put more emphasis in trying to understand people rather than labeling them a certain way, whether it's science or health or politics or how you should raise your kids. They're just or business, because our values will also define what we see as the truth. And then we talked about science and what can we know is true. Well, if you're only working from an empirical standpoint, think about it. We have a limited spectrum of sight. There are probably things that we cannot see. I mean, a bird can see a wider range of colors than we can. So if there are things of a color that is not in that range that we can see, then we can't see them. So that's getting a little bit out there. But I'm just saying that the admission that we cannot know everything and see everything. A lot of quantum physics tries to define everything through mathematical formulas, and you have to be able to prove your theories through the equations, and these are also constantly evolving. When I think of a physicist like Sir Roger Penrose, who has kind of shifted his view and is now kind of leaning towards panpsychism, and whereas you'll have other people go, that's just, that's esoteric nonsense. And so, but that's great. That's great that, not to say that's nonsense, but that's great to be able to live in a world where we have that kind of debate and discussion. And to your point about people asking about, China, and maybe they have a system that works for them, and because you live in a society that you've grown up with different values, you find it hard to appreciate that. But they like the structure, just like if we consider the Amish in the U.S. Who live a very different lifestyle, who reject a lot of automation and live more simply, based on some religious fundamentals, but also a philosophy on the way you should live. And outsiders find that very restrictive, or, how can you live that way? That's so old-fashioned. But if you're living within that community, you might not be able to imagine how the hectic of the modern world and so on. So who's to say which of them has, no one has a monopoly on the truth. And that's why, as you're trying to define, well, what is true? Well, if you grew up in that kind of an environment, in that kind of society, what's true for you will seem very different from someone in a completely different environment, right?
Yeah. And I think that's another important point to make, that when it's not up to the people in power to define the truth. I mean, on paper, maybe that's what's happening, but that does not define the truth, right? The truth is then how the common people sort of say how they view the world, what's their perspective. So when I'm talking about the Chinese perspective, I'm talking about like old Lee, how this person is looking at the world and how he is perceiving life and stuff. And that might be very, very different from a communist party general or whatever. But I think that's what's interesting, and that perspective is very often neglected in any kind of discussion, right? How does the common person on the street view the world?
Exactly.
And of course, then how are their ideas formed, etc. That's another story. But the interesting thing is, if you talk to this person, you'll have very, very different perspectives on what the world looks like. And same with the Amish people, I've never met any, but that would be interesting.
Yeah, and I think there's something to be said for the way they live and the communities they build and the way they raise their children. I think there's probably a lot of positives, where people who don't grow up in that or that kind of community, you can't fathom it, right? And what you said about the truth shouldn't come from power. We often are raised to think that institutions will tell us what's true and what's real and what's right. But often it's those people who are afraid of losing their power, who are wanting to protect their power, will want to monopolize and dictate and say this is what's true and what's not. And you'll find that there are struggles in whether it's being able to control what goes into education. You'll find it's the kind of things that are taught in China or in the Middle East or in Western school. It's different, and they're claiming that's the truth. It's being taught in schools as the truth, and yet different things are being taught in different countries. Whether it's history, whether it's any number of topics, right? So I think this is just another thing to keep in mind when we define what is true, what is true, and especially we can see how these ideas of what is true divide us immensely. I mean, look at the pandemic situation. Majority of people, believing in their institutions and the whatever we're told about the science and especially that term follow the science, but there is no the science. There is science as a process, and within that process there are a variety of ideas, and there are no absolutes, right? And I think, again, these are things that are important to consider as we're trying to define what is true for us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that, maybe this is taking us a little bit off topic, but that, for me, that has to do with trust as well.
Yeah,
Right?
absolutely.
So what kind of truth do you trust, or do you choose to believe? And then if you have trust in your institutions, then it's going to, that's going to have an emphasis or an influence on your belief system or on your perspective of the truth. But if you don't trust the institution, you're going to search for alternative sources, and that's going to have a different influence on your definition of the truth. And you can see that a lot. I mean, as example, with your example during the pandemic, do you, like in Sweden, most people trust the government, so that has an impact on how you go about to handling this crisis. While in the U.S., it's a very different situation, right?
It became very political in the U.S. But then you have other countries like Russia, where they're the people that I know in Russia or are from there who don't trust the government. They just don't trust the bureaucracy. They don't trust the institutions. They see a lot of corruption there, and then it's no surprise that they don't trust anything that is said.
Sure.
And so I think, and this takes me to the whole point about people who consider themselves skeptics. The skeptics who they discount everything first. The sort of default position is to discard a new idea because this is the standard, or this is the established knowledge, and I think that's a very lazy way of looking at the world. To just the default is no, that can't be true, or that I think it's good to ask questions, to be skeptical in that way, but in a curious way. But to automatically discount everything is just as bad as people who jump on every new theory. Those are extremes, right? And so I think, again, as we try to define what's true, we'll have different mindsets and approaches, and also from our psychology. There are people who are more prone to conspiracy theories, and then there are people who just believe everything that the authorities, the institutions tell you. And in both cases, there will be times when you realize that they were totally wrong. So we have all this trust in institutions, and then it turns out the institution was being dishonest, or whether it's they thought it was a legitimate reason, or whether it's they were trying to hold on to power and deceive. And then from these people looking for conspiracies, some conspiracies turn out to be true,
Mm-hmm.
and then a lot of others are just, well, I feel like I'm living in a world where everybody's trying to get me and deceive me, right? So
Mm.
it can be difficult, but it's important to recognize if you're prone to one way or another, right?
Mm.
And recognize where your biases are as you're trying to define what's true for you, because what
Yeah.
you define is true for you will so influence the way you're living your life and the success that you can have. I mean,
Mm.
I've experienced this in coaching when people will say something about themselves as if it were a definitive fact. I'm not good
Mm.
at that.
Yeah.
This always happens to me, and we hear it in people's conversations all the time. They talk about it as if it was truth,
Mm.
and then you ask a few questions and it all crumbles. And they realize, okay, actually, maybe I'm not so certain about that. So it's especially the truths we assume about ourselves. And when you think about, as you grow up, all the messages you continue to hear, and if you hear a lie often enough, you'll begin to believe it's true.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, it's all about the experiences that you've had, the information that you've been exposed to that will have a great impact on what you sort of believe is true. I find it really helpful in a few of the sort of trainings that I've been part of. We frequently come back to the ladder of inference,
Hmm.
which has different steps to which explains, what might happen in the stages of how you define the truth for yourself.
Hmm.
And it's like you sort of you see a situation, and you grasp a few things that you kind of record a few things what you think is important to that, and then you see something else that emphasizes what you just saw, that strengthen that position, and then you climb up that ladder, and you define just a very, very small piece of the whole cake, and you see this is what happened, this is the truth, but you're missing out on a very large portion of the data. And I mean, according to this theory, this is something that we unconsciously do all the time, right? So, but just uh, for me, this theory, or this tool, it's a great reminder of what we're talking about here. So,
Yeah.
how can we ask more questions? How can we try to see a bigger portion of the data? Uh, for me, it sounded like you talked about how can we be more constructively challenging, asking questions, and challenging what we see as truth, etc. So it's just a really good reminder of how we can push ourselves to be more open, yet have the understanding and the humbleness of understanding that we'll never be 100% unbiased, or we will never know the whole truth, as we started by talking about, right?
Absolutely. So this takes us to where one of the places I wanted to go with the conversation is
Mm.
it just I wanted to talk with you a little bit about things that we can do to help us in our pursuit of truth, and in our sorting through all the information, and finding out what's true for us. And I think we've touched on a few of them. One being recognizing the assumptions you've made or your biases, and also really encouraging open debate. And I think that's the ladder of inference is also is a great one, and it comes down to a lot of self-reflection.
Mm.
And we've talked before about listening skills as well, and communication, where seek first to understand, then to be understood.
Mm.
Understanding is part of recognizing that perspective, and the thing that someone else has adopted as truth, and trying to understand why. Why did they believe what they believe? Why did they think that's absolutely true? And then where's the disconnect? Is there something that you're not seeing, right?
Mm.
I think that's a good question to ask yourself. If someone else is, and I'll do this in situations where I find I have the minority view.
Mm.
Where if there's something where most people believe a certain thing, and I am not convinced by that, I'll try first of all to ask myself, what is it I'm missing here? Am I missing some piece of information that's causing me to see things differently? And I think that's very healthy. And then if I can recognize that actually no, I can retrace my steps, or I can consider it more deeply, or I can listen to more opinions, and then I can either confirm that actually no, I still believe what I believe. This is still true for me. Or I'll be convinced. And I think this is the tough thing as people get older and more set in their ways. Not all people. I'm certainly not like that. I find myself still continuing to learn all the time, and continue to, my philosophy continues to evolve. My opinions will change about things as I get more information, which is great. I think a lot of people will feel like they're flip-flopping on issues, or they'll say this about politicians, and I think that's too bad, because as you get more information, why wouldn't you change the way you see the world? Rather than going, nope, this is what I believe. I'm sticking to my guns here, and regardless of what the evidence is telling you, and that's kind of well, it puts you at a disadvantage, right?
Yeah, yeah, I think that's kind of sad that I think very often the public opinion toward politicians is that if they change their minds or change a standpoint on something, that's something that shows that we shouldn't trust them, or and I think that it's the absolute opposite. I think that's great if someone is able to change your mind, that you're able to adapt your ideas and just evolve. Because I'm one of those persons who are constantly feeling unsure about things, and maybe I don't know if it has with my self-confidence or whatever. Yeah, I have enough self-confidence, but I do think that it's really important, and maybe that goes down to my values, the need to be humble, that we don't understand things, and there are a lot of people out there that are a lot smarter than I am, so I want to listen to them. But I don't want to listen to one person. I want to listen to a lot of interesting people and see what they have to say. And this constantly try to learn things. But once you've decided that this is exactly what I believe and this is the truth, I don't think I've certainly been there. I might have been there for a little while, and then I changed my mind again. But for me, I think that's a good thing to be searching for more information and to wanting to understand more. So having kind of a learner or a grow mindset, or whatever you want to call it, but to look for more information, I think that's one thing to have in mind. I think the other one is to be humble, to really understand that there's a lot of things that we don't understand. So I'm certainly not going to pretend that I'm an expert in every area. I want to listen to other people, and then just listen. And we talk so much about listening and active listening, but not interrupting. So when someone is saying something, really listen to what that person has to say, and then you can make your mind up later. But don't, without judging, just really take in information, and then you can utilize that data to increase your palate, so to say.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny what you were saying before about how you talk about people who are leaders. I think you were talking about political leaders, but the person on the street, what's true for them, and you'll find the same in organizations. You'll have people at the board level who, and it's their job to have a very top line view of things, but then you have sort of the people at the in organizations that are doing at their frontline workers that are doing the day to day, and they have a totally different perspective on the truth. And they're in organizations, that's where you'll see some of the disconnect. And so that's where I really respect leaders who will go to the really have conversations with those people at every level of their organization. And you'll start to hear what's true for those people, and it'll change your view of things. And all of a sudden, your view of what's true will change. And I mentioned Elon Musk before. He, things like for SpaceX, he interviews each person. They've got more than 500 people on their staff, and he's running multiple businesses. And so I'm not saying that Elon Musk is the end all be all of leadership. There are qualities about him that I really admire as a leader. There are other qualities where, I've had other people who use him as kind of as a role model or whatever, and I go, okay, yeah, but you realize he believes you to be successful, you got to work like hell, you got to work 18-hour days, right? And that's his philosophy, that's the way he lives his life. Is that that's not what I believe it takes to be successful, because I both know there are only so many hours in the day that you can be fully productive. Maybe not for Elon. Maybe he's a superhuman. So people have said he's an alien because he's able to do so many things and work so long. But again, it's that personal experience. What's true for you, and so that's why there's no one right way of living. There's not one right way of thinking and seeing the world. And I think when we can appreciate that as we're trying to define truth for us, that it's our truth, not necessarily the truth.
The truth, yeah.
Then we'll have so much more tolerance in the world for other people and the way other people are living, and I think this is why some people where you talk about the freedom that some countries think they have, the other people will see as chaos, right? And so there are people who need that kind of structure. They find it very challenging to have too many open questions. And so I had some friends having a discussion during the pandemic about what's true and what's not, and there were lots of different nuanced opinions, which is great. And then there's one friend who said, well, I just believe in the system. He didn't want to think too much about it. He just wanted to trust that the system was doing everything in the best interest of everybody, right? And which is I think it's good to believe in positive intent, but to just go through life going, well, I just trust everything. I'm not saying that people are out there, in a conspiratorial way, but I think people can be wrong. So I think it's good to ask questions. I think that the only way to improve is to try and see where mistakes have been made, or where the way someone sees things maybe isn't the truth, and it's time to investigate further, right? So it's finding that healthy balance, and I think trust is really important. Blind trust can lead to all kinds of bad things.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about the importance of trust. So I mean, for things to work, I mean, especially when you're working with others, it's such an important element. But yeah, still, maybe we're getting into group dynamics. But yeah, to have that as foundation, but then to allow for questions and allow for challenges and constructive challenging, I should say. Yeah, that can be perhaps facilitate our pursuit of the truth, but we're never going to get there, really.
yeah, absolutely. And then you can let go of this. I believe in truth, and I'm going to defend it to the death. It's like, okay, how do you know? Again, getting back to how have you defined what's true, and so on. And I think there probably are some universal truths, or some things that get as close as we can get to absolute truth. There's a scale, right? There are things that we can know fairly certainly, and there are things that there's no way that we can know for certain, and you just take it on faith, right?
Yeah.
And
and saying that, I mean, there's a few things that are kind of holy that we're not even sort of allowed to question or challenge here. So yeah, I'm not going to go out on a limb here, but yeah, just having that in mind. So there are sort of social obstacles of what we are allowed to challenge as well, because we are so uncomfortable with this being untrue.
Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely. And think about that. So that's on a societal level. Think about in organizations. the part of the reason that certain cultures develop in an organization because of the things that we hold to be true, and then it can fall apart because you're proven wrong. You realize that's not the case, and so I think that this belief that you are the arbiter of truth, or what the truth is, it's a dangerous stance to have. I think the humbleness you talked about is really important, to recognize, to take that position that Socrates did, to there's nothing I can know absolutely, and there's far more that I don't know than what I do know. So I think that these are really healthy things to keep in mind as and it's not always comfortable, right? It's not always comfortable to admit that, I'm not sure, and to go, well, this may not be true. I hope it's true. I wish it's true, right?
Yeah.
So those are all super important. So I think hopefully we've gotten through this conversation, people can recognize not only is this a very deep philosophical question that may be too big for some people, get really uncomfortable with this, with the deep philosophical questions, but then on a very practical level, I think there are real day-to-day applications of this, that if you just increased your self-awareness, became more reflective, you'd realize some of these things that you hold to be true are not true at all. And this is the work from Byron Katie, and Eckhart Tolle brings it up. But this, just simply asking that question, when you make a statement, or when you are making assumptions, is that true? Is that true? Especially when it comes to negative things, negative judgments about others or about yourself. Is that true? Is that so? Eckhart Tolle says, is that so? Because that's the way we're defining things, is the way we start to see the world. And that can lead us into a very negative direction, or it can really be disruptive in terms of our relationships, or it can create a roadblock in terms of our success. So what you adopt as true, how you define truth, can have so many day-to-day practical implications. So I hope we've shined some light on that today.
Yeah. No, this was super interesting. I feel like in some ways we could say more, but I don't know what and how. But because it's such a grand topic. So if we had other perspectives and other people joining us, this could be a never-ending discussion.
Absolutely, and I didn't want to go too far off on a few different tangents. There are a lot of ways you can talk about truth and talk about defining it, but I think I wanted to keep it on a practical level and go deep enough to get people to reflect and to think about their sources of information, and be not too cynical, but also not too I don't want to say naive, but too readily accepting just because someone is in the same political camp as you, or they have a similar other views. So you believe everything that they say. I think it's good to be discerning with the truth, be discerning with information, and give people the benefit of the doubt, and in the way you're judging them, and just making an effort to try and understand how they've come to their truth, right? I think then we'd all get along a little better. We'd have more tolerance, but there'd be a lot more harmony in our relationships, in our workplace, in our organizations. That's a bit utopian, but at least getting people to reflect on this will hopefully get us a little closer to that.
Yeah, I agree.
So that seems like a good positive place to wrap this up. I hope the conversation's been helpful for those listening. Just remember, when you're defining your truth, just to take some time to reflect. Know that you cannot know absolutely the truth about a lot of things, about most things, and then just letting other people have their truth. Letting go of that need to be right, and you'll have a lot more harmony in your life. So we'll leave it there. Thanks, Toby. Great to have this conversation with you.
Thanks, Peter. Very interesting.
Thanks for everyone who's listening, who hopefully found this a stimulating conversation, because it's a one of those topics that I'm really inspired by, and yeah, I think much like Elon Musk, I am a truth seeker, but I'm humble enough to know that it's a worthwhile but very daunting task.
Sure is. Yeah.
Okay, we'll leave it for there. Next time it's your topic, Toby, and look forward to see what you come up with. Thanks everyone for listening, and I hope this has been helpful.
Yeah.
Be well.
See you in a few weeks.
All right, thanks, Toby.
Bye.